Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all on again for our third webinar in the series of career decisions, management and leadership in the data and AI world. Today we have a very important topic to discuss, in a sense the big elephant in the room, which is how to get business to adopt data and AI decision making and use the technologies. Last time, in the previous webinar, based on which we also have an article just published today at Inside Knowledge, for those of you who may have missed it, we discussed about how to build and leverage the data capabilities in the organization, the team that does things that work. But unless the business uses it, there is no value in this. So in that sense, that's today a very important part of our themes in this webinar series. We are excited and lucky to have today with us two amazing data leaders and business leaders in the space. Joyce Weng from Bulgaria and Daragh Kelly from Berberys that will join us on video in a few minutes to discuss this difficult and important topic. If we go to the next slide, just a couple of things before we start. Again, this is part of a Tech Talk series, and there is a number of them coming in all the time soon. If you want to know more about these talks and other activities at Inside around the space of digital, data and AI, please visit digital.inside.edu. The series is sponsored and supported by Accenture Strategy. And next slide, please. Again, upcoming tech Talks, May 19, 26, June 2. So plenty coming up almost every week or so. Before we dive into the discussion, a little bit about what the structure of the webinar will be. We'll spend the first 10 minutes or so with my collaborator, Caroline Zimmerman, with whom we have been working on a project for the past more than a year now, based on interviewing by now more than 30 plus data and business leaders, chief data officers, VPs of analytics, some CFOs, some CEOs, MDs, around the space of how organizations build, manage, and leverage the data capability and AI. And based on these interviews, we also run this webinar series with a number of people we also interviewed, plus others, and have the follow-up articles. Now, in this, through these interviews, one can identify various interesting patterns that kind of insights and patterns that you see across organizations. And with Caroline, we'll share the first 10 minutes, some of them related to our topic. And after this brief presentation, we'll dive directly into a discussion with our guests and have some questions from the audience in between. With this, I'm passing the floor to Caroline for the 10 minutes presentation.
Hey, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. And so to share a little bit with you some of the insights that have come from these interviews, we first wanted to share with you what came up when we spoke to people around this topic of data literacy, which surely you've come across yourselves. And often when people think about data literacy, they think about technical upskilling of an organization. So how do you figure out ways to upskill your team of analysts to have more data science skills? And maybe you send them on some Coursera modules or Udacity modules, or you upscale your organization in being able to run their own reports by teaching them SQL, or how to run their own data visualizations using Tableau. And all of these are very important skills, of course. But actually, one of the more surprising insights from the research that emerged was that actually one of the most, if not the most powerful skill that business leaders can develop to harness the power of data and AI is the ability to ask great questions. And the reason that this is so important relates to this quote from Jeff McMillan, who's the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Morgan Stanley and is one of the people that we interviewed in this study and who also participated in our first webinar. And he said, the biggest challenge we have as the data team is not the ability to solve the problem. It's figuring out which problem to solve. And he went on to say that, once you know what problem to solve, the math is easy. And what he was saying there is, data scientists are usually trained in, for example, making sure that the model that they build is the most accurate possible. And so they're going to be really good at taking the predictive power of a model from 85% accuracy to 99% accuracy or something like this, right? But actually, if they're solving for the wrong problem, their skill sets to get that model to be that accurate are not actually going to result in business value because they haven't been pointed at the right problems, right? And this is why developing the skill of being able to ask great questions of the data team has such an outsized impact on making sure that you're getting business value out of your data initiatives. And obviously this is an iterative process. So what emerged from our conversations is this is not just about business leaders and stakeholders being able to ask great questions. It is an iterative process with the data talent in their organizations. And, you know, like one example of that iterative process, I suppose working nicely, was in one of the e-commerce companies that we spent some time interviewing. They had a marketing person who was asking one of their analysts to go and, like, you know, could you please help me understand what our delivery fees are across the UK? And this was going to be a really giant project for the analyst to solve. There was a lot of data wrangling that was going to be involved in answering it. And the head of data at the time said, have you actually tried to find out why it is that they want you to answer this question? And the analyst hadn't actually necessarily done that, or didn't know that, you know, spending some time really trying to figure out why a question was being asked was an important part of his job. So he did go back to that marketer. And it turned out that the purpose for that request, or the motivation behind that request, is that he wanted to convince the sales team to allow him to run a promotional ad that included free delivery. And he needed to be able to make the case for getting that pushed through the sales team, who were quite finicky about allowing free delivery. And that was actually a much easier question to answer than the original one. And the analyst was able to solve that, I think, in a day. Right. And so, again, it's really making sure that both business leaders and stakeholders and the data team are iterating to really come up with good questions. And another way to say that is problem definition, right? And another example that came up in the research that is useful to share with you here is at LinkedIn. So we spoke to some of their most senior data leaders, and they were giving us an example of how a number of years ago, when LinkedIn launched LinkedIn Premium, which is their subscription service, it was actually the data team that noticed that, you know, I think the business team was expecting that the biggest customer segment for them was going to be recruiters, but it actually turned out that it was sales teams, and it was actually the data team who noticed this, and that it wasn't just one salesperson in an organization, it was multiple salespeople in a same organization that were subscribing to LinkedIn Premium. And actually, those people had different personas along the sales funnel. So you had maybe a pre-sales person and an account manager and, you know, people like that. And it was actually the data team's idea to approach the commercial teams to say, hey, we think that there's really an opportunity here for you to develop LinkedIn Premium Enterprise that is really aimed at salespeople. So that's not quite, you know, it wasn't really phrased as a question, but it's an example for you to see how it is an iterative process where the data and insights team surfaces interesting pieces of information, interesting conclusions, interesting things that then can lead to new questions from business leaders and stakeholders back to the data team. So what makes a great question? And, you know, we talked to many people in this study, but it was actually Daragh, who you will hear more from soon, who shared the most succinct and we think useful definition of what makes a great question. So number one, it should be strategically important. So if you're not supporting the top 3 or 4 bets that your strategic bets that your company is making at any given point in time, then it's probably a nice to have. It's probably not what you should focus on. Number 2, is it well banded? And the example that Daragh gave us here, Daragh used to work at Sky, which is a big UK channel, is, the question, can you help me make more successful TV shows, is too broad. Whereas a much more well-banded and well-scoped question could be, should I be doing more or less supernormal shows? So much more specific. And number 3 is actionable. And, you know, if something isn't actionable, in the end, is there really a point in trying to answer it if you can't do anything with that information on the back of it, right? So strategically important, well-banded, and actionable. And the last thing to share before turning this over to our speakers and Theos is thinking about then, how do you generate potential questions? How do you teach this skill to business leaders and business stakeholders? How do you get better at generating potential questions that you can then shortlist for the data team to answer? And again, spoke to lots of different people about this, but one person in particular had a very systematized way of approaching this. And this was Kevin Troyanos, who's the head of analytics at Publicis Health, which is a big media agency that specializes in healthcare. And the way that, that his team goes about it is they get various stakeholders in the room, often in a functional area. So people in a marketing team or people in a finance team or an operations team. Sometimes, especially if they're more senior, they could be transversal across functions as well. And then they go through an exercise that they've based on Mad Libs. And Mad Libs is a game that you may have played many years ago, where you do a sort of a fill in the blank to generate a text. And this one is, if I only knew, fill in the blank with a piece of information, then I would take an action so that I could affect an outcome. So that would be an example of this at Publicis is, if I only knew which patients in my health system were at risk of not taking their medication, then I would design a patient support plan to help them take their medication so that I could reduce their cost of care and improve healthcare outcomes. And the finding from Kevin's exercise is that the quality of the questions generated in the business goes up by a tremendous factor just by being able to follow this. Now, it's one thing to get a list of all the potential things that you could work on. It's another to prioritize them and figure out which ones are actually worth pursuing. I'm not going to go over that here, though. Our speakers will have lots more to say about that topic, so I'll turn the floor over back to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Great. There is a lot in here, as you can see, and I guess that, again, that was only part of the insights, obviously. At the end of the day, it's all about the question of making all of you good business stakeholders when it comes to leveraging data and AI, which is exactly the objective of today's webinar. And with that, as I mentioned before, we have our 2 guest speakers, which I'd like to ask to turn on their cameras now. I see they're on and off a couple of times. Joyce Weng from Bulgaria, and Daragh Kelly from Berberis. Thank you for joining us. I will ask you to introduce yourself in a few minutes as soon as you start in the first question. Let's dive directly into this, but first do a quick poll. We want to help everybody become better business stakeholders, leveraging data and AI. But first, let's understand what are, in your views, in your experience, what are the 2 key factors limiting your ability to leverage data and AI? And you have like 5 choices there. Please take a few seconds to fill this. Let's see what comes back of it. Curious to see. Data, skills in organization, understanding. Let's see. Data availability, skill shortage, lack of clarity, limited technical skills, not a big factor. Great. Challenge to move beyond proof of concept. Sounds like there is quite some progress on that dimension over the years. That would not be the case a couple of years ago, even probably a year ago. So there is obviously lots of development. Daragh, you've been in this space for some time, and you've worked with a lot of business stakeholders in the various roles you played. So let's start from the big elephant in the room. In your experience, what makes a good business stakeholder in your job? And please also briefly introduce yourself when you start. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Theos. How are you doing? Hello, everybody. My name is Daragh Kelly. I'm the VP of Data and Analytics at Burberry, which is a UK-based luxury fashion house. Been at Burberry about 2 years, running the kind of global kind of data and analytics team. Before that, I've had a fairly peripatetic career, kind of always in data and analytics, but across financial services, telco, media, digital startups, even public sector. So that's me.
So going to the question now.
Okay, all right. So what makes a good stakeholder or a business user of analytics? I guess it's probably worth, certainly in my experience, I think starting with the things that maybe don't matter so much. So I think the first thing is I don't see huge value in people who are commissioning insight or exploiting insight, spending a lot of time learning about the mechanics of AI. I see a lot of people going on courses and they're trying to learn that, you know, how neural networks work, or reading up on the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning, or learning the difference between a precision and a recall metric, and kind of similar activities. And I honestly don't see the point. I really don't see the point. I think the second thing that kind of gets a lot of focus that, again, I don't see generating huge amounts of value is the idea of a data translator. So doing, you know, training yourself and becoming that data translator. I think in most organizations, and there are exceptions, I think in most organizations, they often seem to work as post boxes without either the commercial experience or the data experience to kind of do the job of that interlocutor kind of really well. I think what does matter is two things. I think the first thing is being up for it. So I think enthusiasm and energy count for a huge amount in my experience. And what goes with enthusiasm and experience is a willingness to invest time and effort over multiple projects or use cases, in all likelihood, in co-creative development of new capabilities, new ways of doing things, and new sources of value. And of course, being willing to fail a bit along the way, which is where the multiple kind of use cases kind of comes in. So I think that's the first one. I think the second one then, if you're up for it, the next thing is to be up to it. And I think, what does up to it actually mean? And when I start looking around an organization for kind of opportunities to use data and analytics to drive value, I look for people who have the ability to ask these good questions. And I think that's the fundamental insight skill, is to be able to ask a good question, i.e. to commission insight, and the ability to do something with the answer. Those are the two bits, the demand side, and you know, pick up the ball and run with it. And for me, we talked a bit earlier, I think a good question is one that is, you know, very specific and well-bounded. It's targeting a measurable business goal or target. And it can be used, you know, in the particular organizational or technical or commercial environment in which it lands. And I think it's really easy to say, well, just ask good questions then. And if that was all it was, I think it would be easy. So I think kind of, how do you do that and how do you train that? I think what I found works very well is that, very similar actually, I've not seen it before today, but the publicist health approach, that kind of hypothesis kind of led approach where you ground, I think the only difference I would see is you try to ground it in what you already know. So rather than just sitting in a meeting room and sticking post-its on a wall, thinking of kind of questions, I think trying to ground it in what you already know. So kind of, you know, my slight variation on the formulation is, you know, we already know X, and from X, we believe Y might be true. And if Y is true, we can do Z, and that will deliver value. Let's go and test if Y is true. And I think that kind of framework that is hypothesis-led, you could train people on that relatively quickly and easily, and it encourages those kinds of well-bounded, action-oriented kind of questions. I think one of the best ways to do it is in true rapid iteration, so kind of sprint and Scrum, kind of agile-based kind of things with rapid iteration, where every day you meet to ask and you set up the new hypotheses, which are based on what you learned the previous day, and those kinds of things. And you can learn a lot very quickly in that way, and you can accelerate the quality of the decision-making that's happening and the question generation in the organization. So that's kind of my take on stakeholders.
Thanks. There are lots in here. There is bootstrapping and iterative learning. There is the art and science. You talk about hypotheses, it's very interesting. Basically, everybody's becoming a little bit of a scientist in a sense, right? It's a very scientific way of thinking. But at the same time, the data science, analytics, AI, everything's about, in some sense, the art and science. So there is some art in this, and there is some science in this. And you also mentioned initially the relevance, or not necessarily too much the relevance of technical skills, which luckily the audience said that's not really a limiting factor for them, as we saw, interestingly. Just one quick question on a term you used, and I'm going to this because it's been overused and potentially also abused, and maybe there is no use for it. The term of translators. Do you think that works? Do you think that's something we should be developing? Let's say things that companies should be training people to become translators, or it's like not really necessary.
I think it's like almost anything. I mean, it's almost climbing a mountain without ropes. There are a small number of people who do it very well, but most people just fall off the mountain, and it ends pretty badly. And I think there are some really brilliant translators out there, but I think it requires such a rare individual with such a combination of skills and intellectual kind of interests that they're so rare that I think it's not a practical proposition for most organizations. What you tend to end up with is a bag carrier, someone who goes back and forth between various teams, basically carrying messages. So they're not translating; they're a pigeon. And I think that's kind of what you end up with. I think it's much better to get your stakeholders asking really good questions than it is to kind of create the translator role that disintermediates and prevents those conversations kind of happening often.
Exactly what we've been hearing. And it's interesting how this term translators was so popular for a few years. And it seems now that we get to know that it doesn't really work. You need to really train you really have to business stakeholders be able to ask the right questions and iteratively learn how to leverage data and the art and science of this process. And one of the best, most impressive executives we talked to about how to do this has been you, Joyce. It's been really amazing to see how you've been mastering during your career the art of asking good questions and leveraging data in your daily job. So I'll start with a very, very practical question, which I'm sure the audience would very much appreciate and value, which is, tell us about how you do this. Tell us about your daily routine in a sense. What does data come into your daily routine in some ways? But before you do this, please only briefly introduction to yourself, and then move to the question.
Sure. Hi everybody. Thank you for joining, and thank you for the invitation. So I'm Joyce Weng. I'm the managing director of Bulgari in charge of UK, based in London. I have been in Bulgari since 2004, very, very long time. I only left the company 2 years in between. Then I regretted. I wanted to join back right away. So I was very lucky to join. So I have been here many, many times, many years. I witnessed the starting of the business from China all the way to Greater China. And until one day we become the #1 nationalities of the Bulgari in the whole world, and the company offered me the opportunity to come to UK to become a managing director. So it has been 2 years. I really enjoy being a managing director in Bulgari, UK, having a great team here. Thank you. So now I answer the questions to Theo. Okay, my routine is very easy. So you reminded me, last week I was in another talk with a lot of CEOs actually. And those CEOs were telling me that in average, they wake up at 4 in the morning and do their job in like 1 hour. Basically they finish at 5, the whole world business, then start to do their own breakfast routine and everything. So for me, I cannot wake up at 4. So I wake up at 6 or 7. But what is the same thing? I realized that I have the same enthusiasm like all the CEOs is that I always wake up with a big smile. I open my eyes and I couldn't wait to indulge into my data app to see what I did yesterday. Then my day starts. So usually I will wake up and then have my coffee and then look out and think about what could be interesting when I open the app. Then I switch on the app. Then I understand what has been showing me from yesterday. I understand from my store from A to B to C to D what they did yesterday. I understand how my e-commerce was performing. I understand what was selling yesterday. I understand what was really not selling yesterday. I understand what I spent money yesterday, but today it didn't show up what the result should be expected to. So those are all the very important questions I got from the data in the morning. Then I start to ask myself to list down what are the questions that I should have when I go to my executive members. Don't forget, I have a very good team in UK and everybody's experts in the data, in all the categories. They are all the best in London. However, if I don't prepare myself, how can I talk to them? So I prepare my habit. Every day I need to list down 3 or 4 key questions for my team members. And then, of course, I need to compliment the one who is very good, but the one who could be better. For example, in the morning, if I see the e-commerce sales, if we only did 150K yesterday, then I will start to think about why so. We're supposed to do 250. Then I will think about, I will look into the traffic. I will look into the daily, trend versus last year. Then I will look into the product we sold compared to last year, even a week ago. Then I will have different questions. Then I will go to the office and I will call my digital manager, like, what happened? Why we only did this one and how could we do better? By asking or talking to her, I actually learned a lot. Every day is a different world. She always tells me different reasons. The way we design the mechanism of this campaign is from A to B to C. What we need to do is we need to wait for data to show us what could be better. So, I'm impatient, but I get what they're saying. So I will list down, take down the notes. Then I'll go to another person, for example, my marketing head. Then I'll ask her, we invested this money, and the result is like this. I don't see it's picking up. What do you think it is like that? What can you do? I mean, what can we do to do it better? So every day, because of the data, I have my own questions. And because of my questions, I understand the market better. I understand every day what is going on in my routine. And this is happening every day. But don't forget, actually, not only the data is helping me to make the decision, because I think the human contact, like I need to speak to my team to understand how they convey the data. What do they think about the data? Because I think it's very important. We need to combine data, numbers, analysis versus what my experts are thinking, looking at that. Then I can make a right decision. So I think that is very simple routine I have every day.
Joyce, that's I believe this is extremely practical. Yes, I don't wake up at 4 a.m. myself either, but I also don't do what you do every day looking at the data. And I'm sure that's not a habit everybody's doing, and asking questions is fantastic. And we thought with Caroline when we discussed this is like, wow, exceptional. And exceptional thing. We'll come back to this later on. So you tell us how you developed these skills and how you were coached and how you coach others to do the same. But before we move, we take a quick break with questions. I'm going to go back to you, Daragh, for another impressive story we discussed that's worth really sharing. Burberry's and computer vision. Now think about that, right? So we saw from Joyce the art of understanding the business based on data and asking good questions in the process and learning from the team. But now we'll have to talk also about the art of the possible with AI and computer vision at the forefront of this. So Daragh, can you tell us a bit more? How does a retailer like Burberry, first of all, use computer vision? How do you come up with this? And more important, maybe that's the last question, the most interesting one. Practically, how do we get the organization? How do you get your business to kind of understand the art of the possible with these technologies?
Okay, so I think the first thing to probably point out is the kind of with a company like Burberry, machine vision is actually pretty important. It's a creatively driven fashion business. So we live in a world of physical products sitting in a physical store. We're a words and pictures and video business. So actually kind of machine vision and NLP and everything else are pretty important to us. And I think going back to the art of the possible, I think kind of one of the computer vision kind of examples I'm going to go through is a really good example of both absolutely the right way and absolutely the wrong way simultaneously to communicate the art of the possible and to build kind of appetite and enthusiasm for new ways of using data in places maybe it wasn't used before. But I'll describe the project itself first. So I think one of the things that certainly I'm being relatively new to retail, I hadn't quite realized until I joined the industry, was that one of the most valuable marketing channels for a retailer, even in this omni-channel age, is the store window and the display in the store window. And that's particularly important if the store windows are in kind of, really valuable locations like Regent Street in London or Ginza in Tokyo or 57th Street in New York. So huge amounts of effort go into designing these visual merchandising displays in these windows. And the goal of these windows is pretty single-minded. It's to get people to turn left or right and walk into the store. So understanding what does and does not work in terms of these windows displays is like a pretty important question. Now, even a couple of years ago, this was not an analytically tractable problem. This was a problem that relied on human expertise and judgment. But I think as we go, as machine vision algorithms mature, this is starting to change. So at Burberry, what we were looking at was the thematic features of the window. So kind of things like, is it a busy window or is it a very uncluttered, simple window? Does it use color contrasts or a more restricted palette? Does it use warm or cool colors? And we looked at that across different locations. As you would expect, tastes differ, and what works in Asia doesn't necessarily work in Europe, and so on and so on. And the goal of that was to establish new visual merchandising strategies, the ones that would drive more footfall. So that's the project itself. So how did it start off? Well, probably in exactly the wrong way, which is through a chance conversation. So it started in the office and then continued in the pub between myself and some people from our visual merchandising team. Now I'm Irish, so I quite like going to the pub, but I'm not sure me going to the pub is a scalable model for rolling out kind of AI and data and analytics kind of at any large company. So what we decided to do was, learning from this model, was do something rather different that didn't rely on serendipity and good luck and personal networks and an Irishman who likes going to the pub to discover these new value-driving kind of opportunities. So we created something, basically an insight newsroom capability. And it was something that I learned when I was working at Sky in terms of media companies, news companies, and how do they work and how do they communicate information that people don't necessarily know they need to know or want to know, and how do they go about doing that? And it was actually inspired by a tour of the Sky News newsroom when I worked at Sky. And we created this thing called a Burberry Insight Hub, which was our insight newsroom. And we hired into our data and analytics team a non-analyst, a non-data scientist, a journalist. And their job was to build that insight newsroom and a consumer-grade news hub just for insight. And it focuses on two things. One, around supporting decision-making. So making sure that new insights are delivered to people who might use them to make better decisions without them necessarily having to ask for stuff. So lots of recommender systems and really good search engines and all the rest of it, kind of driving, what I see versus what Theos sees or whatever it might be. And the second bit around the art of the possible was creating an area within that hub and a newsletter, which we call the Friday Fix. And its only purpose is to communicate the art of the possible. Its only purpose is to get people to try and think about, could data and analytics help me solve this problem? Even though it's something that maybe I wouldn't have thought was data and analytics could help with. So it helps people surface new and innovative ways of using AI machine learning. We found this mechanism is really successful and drives lots of, not just enthusiasm, but intelligent demand and considered demand kind of from new stakeholders.
Thanks, Daragh. Very inspiring. All part of the story, including the pub one, of course. Nothing wrong with that. But yeah, love the story and very practical. Let's take a quick break with a Q&A with some questions from the audience. So I'll invite Caroline back. Caroline, some questions?
Yeah, hi. So unfortunately, I got booted out of Zoom and I lost the historical Q&A. However, I remember I hope I do a good enough job of remembering and paraphrasing this one, but it's around how important is industry experience for being able to get value out of your data and analytics insights. And this is a question for both of you, but Joyce, it might be interesting to talk a little bit about how you don't even have anyone that's specifically a data person in your team. So industry experience is clearly very important. But yeah, over to you guys. Would be great to hear your thoughts.
So I go first, Daragh?
Yeah, go for it, Joyce.
All right. So for me, because I don't have a data team, we do have one in headquarters, and which they provide very sufficient data to us weekly or even monthly. So therefore, locally, in order to understand what is going on for my business, that we need to rely on a lot of interpretation and study. So basically, every day I am reading a lot of numbers, not just every day, I mean, whenever I feel like it. So then I combine with the result from what I see from the business every week. Then I understand actually what is working out right, what is not. The thing is not to only have the data to understand what to do. The data team can provide me very good translator on what is it saying. However, it is very important for me and my team to use our own knowledge and own experience to read the data. For example, today I was reading with my digital manager, understanding the traffic versus last year, audience-wise, their profile, their background, everything. Actually, it's very interesting, very different. We were in lockdown last year, but this year we are not in lockdown. We are semi-open. Literally today we open the restaurants, but customers' behaviors are different. We were hoping the sales will pick up even more and more. Although I spoke to different leaders in the industry, I know that actually e-commerce slowly down a little bit, just a little bit. However, I still wanted to talk to my team, whether it's from digital marketing, to understand what we are doing should be right and how do we cope into our business strategy. So even though I don't have a data team, but I think it is very important for me to echo, review inside out, and then we confirm together on what to do. We commit to the right, to the only one objective. That's what matters to me.
Daragh, any brief answer as we are at the clock speaking about the importance of industry expertise?
I think it's really important. I'll give you a quick example. I think when COVID hit, we started having some challenges where when our warehouses and our hubs, of course, when they bring in temporary staff, historically, they were able to do that pretty quickly. But kind of when you've got social distancing and all the rest of it, you can't bring in lots of people quickly. You've got to plan in advance and bring them in slowly so you can space them out. And that means that two things are happening. One, it's a chaotic environment in terms of COVID and everything else. So it's harder to predict what's going to happen. And the second thing is that not only do your forecasts is it harder to forecast accurately, but you have to forecast accurately further out. So I think in terms of those kinds of challenges, understanding, the operational process into which your algorithm, in this case, is kind of deployed is really important. And I think this is one of the reasons why getting those good questions flowing from the stakeholders is really good, because then, of course, they already have that. And if they're able to articulate what they need, in this case, I need a forecast that is 10% more accurate than the one I have now, and I need it 4 weeks earlier than I have it now. And if I have that, I can save this amount of money. I think those are the kinds of questions that you start to be able to answer if you've got that business process knowledge. But if you're just trying to forecast into a vacuum, it's not going to be useful. So whoever the questioner is, I completely agree with them. I think they're on the money.
Great. So let's move to another question, which is not about industry specificity or expertise, about company and culture specificity. Everybody talks about data culture, data-driven organizations, data-driven decision-making, how important culture is in the organization, but potentially also geographically. You also moved to different places. Joyce, you went from China to the UK, which is a very interesting transition, and would love to hear about differences between those cultures also. Any comments on any differences that you experienced in your moves across organizations or across locations about what makes one company more or less data-oriented? Let me start with you, Daragh, this time, and then go to Joyce.
Okay. So I think in terms of the cultural kind of bit, I think there's a bit of a false dichotomy, I think, sometimes. There's organizations that are kind of data-driven, and then there are organizations that aren't, and those that aren't aspire to become data-driven. And I think there is this kind of assumption that there's a certain type of organizational culture that is less willing to adopt these evidence-based kind of decision-making kind of approaches and everything else. Now, kind of looking at it through kind of my lens, I split my career between organizations and industries that are seen as being very data-driven, like financial services and digital and telcos and everything else, and creative industries that are often seen as being pretty allergic to this way of thinking and working. TV, making TV programs, luxury fashion and so on. And I think, like any cliche, there's a grain of truth in it, but I think it is actually misconceived, because I think what's actually going on here is something quite different, which is, I think, rather than the problem being the culture of the organization and the culture needing to change, I think the problem often is that data and analytics professionals adopt this one-size-fits-all kind of approach, and they don't take the time to understand the values and objectives of people who don't necessarily think like them. So they tend to work very well with the performance end of marketing teams or the finance function, but not so well with the creative end of the marketing teams or or areas like that. And I think understanding the values and objectives of people who are not conventionally data driven, and then not adapting your approach to help them meet those objectives is kind of pretty important. And I think kind of one of the things that really kind of causes problems is where data and analytics is perceived as, often correctly, constraining creativity and kind of privileging or prioritizing other objectives like efficiency or transparency or reliability or something like that. Things that people might think might strangle creativity. So I think the really important thing is to recast the problem of going, how can I help people in the organization which I'm in now, and thinking about their objectives and their values and their KPIs and their unofficial KPIs, because every organization has unofficial KPIs to go with the official ones, thinking more deeply and more humbly, and taking some time to really understand what's really going on in the organization, and building around that. And I think that's kind of pretty important. And I think if you ask the question, how do I use data and analytics to empower creatives, to make creatives even more creative, to amplify unheard voices within the organization, and just generally to support creativity, I think then you're onto something. Now, kind of, thinking about that more concretely at Burberry, one of our core beliefs at Burberry is creativity open spaces. It's kind of a slogan. You'll see it written on the walls, kind of in the building and all the rest of it. And that's the role that data analytics performs. It opens spaces. It allows creativity to develop. So that could be as simple as, we spend a lot of time automating dull stuff for creative people, things that they hate doing and they're no good at anyway, or making operational processes more reliable so the creative teams can just get on with what they do best. It could be, kind of doing things that inspire creativity. So providing consumer, a better understanding consumer needs and preferences that can inspire the creative teams, the product development teams, and the marketing teams to create commercially valuable and compelling propositions that consumers will like and want. Or it could be, sometimes someone's got a crazy idea. It's a really crazy idea. And actually data and analytics can help to validate that idea and well, no, maybe it's not such a crazy idea. Maybe it's not as risky as we thought it was. It's still a punt, it's still a gamble, but maybe not as big a one as we thought. And one of my old colleagues at Sky used to use the phrase creativity within a framework. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, which is effectively, it's a supporting framework. That's what data and analytics is. It's a supporting framework that can enable creativity. And if you think about the problem in that way, think about how is my job is to make creative people even more creative. It takes you to a very different place. And suddenly a lot of those cultural problems just melt away. They melt away.
I love it because you are breaking a couple of myths today. We're breaking one, the myth of the translators. The other is the myth that Joyce has broken repeatedly, which is you need to be a data leader, data person, data expert, or quant to leverage those technologies. No, you don't. You need to be curious and have the right routines and processes and the right mind frame, as you both said. And the third is that there is no dichotomy between creativity and data and organizational culture, making such a black and white kind of distinction, which is very, very optimistic in some ways, right? So it's again the art and the science going together. Joyce, you moved from China to the UK, and I don't want to get into sensitive kind of cultural differences across regions, but yet when we discussed, you mentioned about how you slowly changed the UK culture itself to become much more technology, data, and data driven. Can you tell us a little bit about how you changed the UK culture and also differences between where you were and where you landed 2 years ago?
Okay, thank you. For me, it's a very dramatic change from China. I was based in Shanghai for 12 years, working for Greater China. So it's compared to UK, it's very different. I have to say that I was developed as a machine in China from the company. It was a great training program. because given my background is very different. For those of you know that I came from a PR marketing background. That means I'm really much into creativity. But then for some reason, because I wanted to grow better and the company committed to develop me, so I learned how to read the data to help myself, to elevate myself, to become another person as the leader, important position in the company. But during this transition, I didn't feel anything too dramatic because I was all in China. Until I came to UK, I realized that actually, I remember in the first few months when I had meeting with my team were very polite to me. When we were reading the report or the result or survey or analysis, they were very politely, very British, very elegant English to explain to me what the report says. But then I was curious on a few questions, but I couldn't ask them the way the approach that I used to have in China, because in China, for example, we were over flooded by all kinds of data from the whole world. Yeah, so we had to find a very efficient way to read and pick and choose the information we wanted to adapt it into our strategy and action plan. But here we only have a few data. Yeah, the team is smaller, market is smaller compared to China. But what can we do? So I started to use the very little data to ask questions to my team. And gradually in the beginning, from very quiet, elegant, polite way of conveying the presentation to me, I asked them questions, and slide by slide, thanks to my talent, I'm very good with the mathematics. So usually I'm very quick at picking up the data and numbers, and they realize that actually I'm very good with numbers, so they need to be very clear and precise. So gradually in the very 2-3 months, they were not used to me asking questions, because if you have questions, I guess I was supposed to be asked separately, individually, politely, with rephrase the way I wanted to ask. But then I had to be myself. I had to be authentic, being a leader here. So gradually I lead by example. I ask them different questions, slide by slide. Then by asking questions, I realized actually they have the expertise. So culturally, there's nothing different. It's just that they are not used to the approach I had, which is very aggressive, which is very direct. I will ask a question or I will express what I need to do in 1 minute, whereby, for example, some people may spend 20 minutes to explain what they want. So after they get used to it in a few months, they started to prepare themselves in a presentation meeting with me, a few slides with the Excel file, with the presentation, with the graph and pie chart. In the beginning, it was so much. I felt it was so cute when my team came to me with different preparation. I feel so proud because I helped them to elevate themselves from a very simple talking, what I did, what I'm going to do. My team is great. Until one day, a few months later, they came to me with proper 6 slides to talk about what happened before, what am I doing now, where do I want to go to, what I need, according to all the analysis from the system, from you, Joyce, Weng, to help me to make it happen. I have to say in 2 years' time, I really pushed them to become another kind of, I wouldn't say animals, but I would say machines. But the point is, in the process, they are very happy and they enjoy the process. Now they have even better presentation to talk to me when I am in a meeting with them. So I'm really happy. And you know what? Different nationalities actually taught me a lot, because I need to understand from their answers. So I know their questions. I understand what they are thinking. So we can do it together, articulate a better journey together to make it happen. So the whole process is very different.
So it works. It's a slow process. It's a continuous refinement, and eventually everybody gets it. So that's, of course, another optimistic message here. We don't have much time. I'd like to get a quick question from the audience. If there's something, Caroline, if you may come back.
Yeah, definitely. I think the best one to ask here is, how are you applying the data that you have? For example, are you applying it as a predictive layer in decisions, or for the innovation of new products and services?
I'm not sure if I get, sorry, I'm not sure if I get your question. Do you mind to repeat
Yeah,
again?
so of course I'll repeat it, just a second. How are you applying the data you have? I think that we can just leave it at that. What kind of decisions give us, and I think that people learn best from stories. So any very, very concrete examples of how you're applying the data that you have to drive a decision, to drive an innovation, or to predict something in the future.
There's something about innovation, I think, maybe Joyce and Daragh, a little bit around the innovation you discussed, Daragh. An example.
Okay, so I think it's a really good question. I think in a creatively driven fashion business, we're focused on things like personalization, on forecasting, on introducing kind of reliability kind of into processes and all of those kinds of things, as well as providing an outside-in view of the fashion consumer. And that's the big focus of our kind of activity, and understanding consumers and enabling kind of core business processes, whether they're marketing, supply chain, retail, kind of whatever. I think in a creatively driven fashion business, the role of data and analytics is to allow creative people to be creative. So, in terms of kind of using data and analytics to drive new products and all of that kind of stuff, it's not the way we compete as a business. So we don't do that much of it, truthfully. We provide a rear view mirror that kind of helps people understand what worked and what didn't, and we support a lot of experimentation and testing and scenario modeling and all of that kind of thing. But the core creative act is done by a person, and I don't think that will change.
Well, let's see how the future evolves. But that's an interesting view in year 2021. Who knows? We may be surprised. Joyce, well, both of you actually. I have a couple of more questions before we wrap up. So there are lots of things you can do, lots of initiatives, lots of projects, lots of proofs of concept, and finally products. How should we think about prioritizing what one can do with these technologies? Just to go to this last theme that we want to discuss together with you, prioritization. I don't know if you want to take it first, Joyce, or Daragh, or whoever you like, maybe.
Daragh can go first.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so a couple of stages kind of I go through, going from macro to micro. So the starting macro thing is basically...
Just go briefly because we don't have much time. I'm saying I would like if you just be brief. Sorry.
Okay, all right. So firstly, I'll just look at the P&L and understanding kind of where's the money and where's the value. So if you're not playing in the big value drivers of the business, or kind of where we spend our money or where we make our money, then you're probably not playing in the right place. And I think a lot of data analytics functions get trapped or stuck in the areas with the most data or the easiest use cases or the best stakeholders, whatever it might be. I think the next bit then is those good stakeholders that can ask good questions. So anchor on good stakeholders will always be my advice. Don't go to use cases. Anchor on stakeholders, then find the use cases. The next bit then is having a portfolio, and that's different time horizons. So you need some stuff that's kind of short term, short time to value, short time to deliver, that pays the rent, basically, and makes you a profit center. There's then medium or longer term stuff that is about building things that will deliver value in the longer term, but maybe don't have an immediate return, but do have a financial return. And then you've got foundational activities around things like data governance, around documentation, standardization, templates, core technology platforms that are basically the foundational things that are a stepping stone to the next phase in your strategy. And finally, and I emphasize the word finally, because I think it is the last thing, and a lot of people do this as the first thing, which is marshalling your use cases. So, I think that's very important. Do that last. And then you assess them against all the usual stuff, value, risk, time to value, and everything else. But you do that after you've worked out, I'm playing in the right part of the organization, I'm working with the right stakeholders, I've got the right portfolio of long, short, medium, and long-term things. And then you kind of get on with just kind of building those use cases and everything else. And I think that's one way of avoiding that AI trap of, I'm sure everyone's heard the statistic, 80% of AI projects never get past POC stage. And I think one of the reasons why is because everyone starts with use cases that don't build iteratively into an organizational capability that is actually sustainable and advancing forward each time.
Yeah, iterations and learning. Absolutely, that's what we heard multiple times today, which is absolutely important. Sorry, Joyce, if you don't mind, I'm gonna briefly ask you a question about COVID, just because that's you brought it earlier on, and I'm curious what we can share with us, and then close with the final question with both of you. So, how has COVID changed the way you've been working, and what do you think is coming? You start talking about things being different today than what it was before COVID. What can you share with us about how things changed in terms of how you leverage technology during COVID? We heard about COVID being great for investments in technology in many companies, but maybe not in retail. What changed?
I think the COVID really helped us and myself to really accelerate the digitalization in this market. For example, when COVID happened, we didn't even have really a proper team to operate e-commerce. We didn't even have my store managers or my store team, sales team, to really understanding how to speak to clients without physical contact. So I think COVID changed everybody in the retail business. So you can see Selfridges, they put down the big sign that's changed. I think that's the future. Even now, what I have done is that I supported my team. I understanding what they need to do, but before that, I share my vision, where we want to achieve. Then it's very important to really listen, because I'm not a very young generation Z or digital tech savvy person. But I realize that listening to the team, because they know the market very well, but pick and choose, formulate the best formula, what we want to do is very important. What COVID really helped me is to understand what is the future business in 5 years' time. So nowadays, in my previous few months, I already worked on the 5 years plan, what to do in 5 years plan, because we need to prepare ourselves better. You never know what's gonna happen. You cannot just take it for granted. What happened before doesn't mean it will be the same today or tomorrow. So I encourage my team to think further. So we develop. Echo back to what you're questioning, and what is a big change? I believe the big change will come from the clients. If we know the client better, what they want in 3 or 5 years' time, you would define your team better. You would define what kind of new technology you want to adapt into your strategy better. So that would be my question.
Thanks, Joyce. And for the last minute, I'll pass the floor to you, Daragh, for a question around what will be the big change that Joyce started touching upon. What are the big changes you think we should expect in this space going forward?
So I'll remind you of the stat I quoted earlier: 80% of AI projects never make it out of proof of concept. And I'll give you a second to go with it, which is 90% of large companies are not getting any return from their AI investments. And that's pretty solid research. And I think one of the reasons is because we're too focused on POCs, on gimmicks, on use cases, on good stories that we can tell at presentations like this, and not enough on foundational capabilities, productizing what we've created, building strong data governance and data quality foundations behind it, focusing on engineering. At Burberry, we have a rule: if we hire a data scientist or an analyst, we hire a data engineer, one-to-one every time, so we can support those foundational kind of capabilities. They're not very glamorous, but they're really important. So I think that's the big one for 2021, 2022 is productization, productionization, scale. Those are the big things that are going to change, and it's happening already, but I think it's coming faster.
Yeah, indeed, the idea of data products and productization has been taking a lot of momentum in the past, months, maybe year or so in the space, and companies are moving indeed from POCs to products with a P&L, not just a cost, and we see more of those happening. Unfortunately, we're out of time. All I will do is just thank you both for joining us. It's been a very inspiring webinar. We saw a lot of myths breaking down. We saw a lot of optimism. We saw that everybody can do this. There is no black and white. There is no division between the science, the quants, and the non-quants. It's both together in an iterative fashion. And there is a lot of innovation happening out of all sorts of places, including serendipity, obviously, with some processes to enable companies to understand the art of the possible, and with products being developed going forward out of all this. POCs and innovations. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you here, and thank you everybody for joining the webinar. Have a good
Thank you,
evening.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.